for having me. This is an honor. It was a very nice opening. Thank you. Gosh, I feel like crying a little bit. So if I do, I do that a lot. And it's just emotion moving through me, and it's okay. Um, it doesn't stay around. So my name is Jen Bushman. I live in New Mexico now, born and raised in the Pacific uh, Northwest. Always had abilities, and it felt very different as a kid. I could know what people were thinking. I could feel the rocks, the trees, the soil. Um, and had that experience when I was 5. We were out on the Olympic Peninsula, and it was our first backpacking trip, and we were with family friends. So there were 4 in our family and 4 with our friends, and 2 kids each. And so I was in front of everyone. I was leading the pack. There had been a storm, a big storm out on the Olympic coast, out on the ocean. And it was so big that it unearthed a whole bunch of Native American artifacts and a longhouse. So we hiked out there to, look at these artifacts and see what was going on. And we had to hike along these boards in order to get to the beach because it was very marshy. And we're walking along, and I could see these monkeys in the trees, and they were jumping from tree to tree. And I turned around and I said, you didn't tell me there were monkeys here. And because they were moving with us as we were walking. And my dad said, no, Jenny, there's no monkeys here. But I kept turning around because I kept seeing them. And I was like, why aren't you seeing these? And I became pretty adamant. And yeah, he was, kind of irritated with me asking. So I fell back behind the group, and they continued forward. And I got busy trying to tie my socks up because they kept falling down. And I looked up, and there was the mother and the 2 juvenile Sasquatch. To me, they looked like monkeys. I mean, I was 5 years old. I didn't understand what Sasquatch was or beings of the forest. And so, I thought, wow, I wasn't scared. I could tell she was their mother. She had that kind of a stern, kind of motherly energy. And I was just really excited. I wanted to play. They were very loving and friendly, and I was not afraid. And so I started forward, and telepathically, the mother told me to go and catch up with my family. She said, no, and go catch up with your family. And so I did. And, from my dad's reaction, I knew not to bring it up again, to not talk about it. And it wasn't until uh, I was about 13 or 14 when my aunt was working for the Army Corps of Engineers, and this was up in Seattle. And we lived down in the Gig Harbor area. And it's very woodsy, and we lived on 40 acres. So I walked through the woods to get to the bus stop. And so I just knew I had a real unusual relationship with forest beings. I would see fairies, I would see little people, and I thought this was just kind of normal. But I also knew that it wasn't something to really talk about unless you found special friends like at school. And I had a couple of those that I could talk to about that. When I was 13, 14, my aunt had this pamphlet that was put out about endangered species in Washington State, and one of the beings was Sasquatch. And I looked at that and I was like, and I tried to talk to my aunt like I was pointing at I was like, you believe that? You believe? And then the whole family was like laughing at it and no, and oh, it's got to be a joke. And they seemed truly puzzled by, and I thought, well, that's so weird. They're a government agency who put out a pamphlet, but I didn't say anything. So then time continued on, and I had experiences, but I didn't really understand what my experiences were. When I was 19, I did have a suicide attempt. Growing up, it was like I was never enough. I played the oboe in the youth symphony. I was an athlete and I did well. I did well in school, but my family, just the dynamic was such that I was just never enough. And so by 19 years old, I just ran out of gas and I wanted to just go. And so I tried, and that's when I um I was walking, I took a whole bunch of pills, and so then I was walking down towards a tunnel, a warm tunnel, and there was my grandma Leela and my best friend Chris Fagan. He died of a brain tumor when we were 6, and we used to play a lot together because I grew up on Fox Island and we lived out at the other end. And so there was just so much Scotch broom and woods to play in. And so we were always adventuring together. I was really excited to see him. And when I was walking towards that light, oh my God, the relief and the warmth and the love. It was amazing. And it was exactly what I needed. And I was excited. I'm ready to go. And my grandma, when I got to them, she just shook her head and she said, no. And then I was back in my room and I was lying in my bed and there was a man beside my bed. And he was about 6'5", and he had long gray hair with little glasses. And he had on a flannel black and red checked shirt over like this white long tunic-y thing with jeans. And I was like, what is this? And so I said, who are you? And it was like he was trying to find the word, you guys, like, he was like, well, and I said, a volunteer firefighter, because I thought, well, who else would be in the room would be like a first responder. But this was Gig Harbor, Washington. And back then, they depended on volunteer services for the first responders. So I, uh, it seemed really just weird, but I didn't think of it like that. And then we just started in, and he told me, um, it's not always going to be like this for you, and you just have to stay. And I was like, what? I was thinking, what a weird thing for this man to say. And, but I felt very loved and very cared for. Like I hadn't had that kind of love and caring from someone, in so long. And um, it was just, it was amazing. And some more words were spoken. And then my boyfriend came home because we were living together, and he called the 911. And then all of the paramedics were there and took me out. And so I was in the back of the ambulance, and they fed me charcoal so I would vomit up the medication. And this man just stood there kind of on the periphery, just looking at me, and I'd look at him and he'd just smile and nod like that. And then he disappeared. I was taken to the hospital. So it was a couple days later, and I was walking up towards my car, and I had a Carmen Ghia, a Volkswagen Carmen Ghia, a blue one. My friend Kathy had a yellow one. We would commute to school together. We were going to the community college in Tacoma. And um, when we would go through, like stoplights, and I would see like this pink Carmen Ghia, and when we'd go through the light, or I would see it, like 4 times this happened. And I would say to Kathy, because we were into our Carmen Gias, we'd work on them and, mess around with them. And so I was like, did you see that? Did you see that? It's a real pretty pink. It was like a pink, purpley, luminous kind of color. Um, and she'd say, no, no. And so when I was walking up a couple days after coming home from the hospital, and I was walking up to my car, we lived right on the street, and that pink Carmen Ghia was coming down the street at the end. We were at the end of Gig Harbor. And um, I was like, oh my gosh. And then it like slowed down, and swear to God, it was like in a fog or something for just a few seconds or minutes. I don't know how long, but it was that man. And he was driving that pink Carmen Ghia, and he just waved at me, and my jaw, dropped to the ground. And I was like, this is just so weird. It was all so surreal. And then he drove off, and I didn't see him again. And life got better for me after that. There was just, after an NDE and maybe a suicide attempt, you get clarity. You get, there's just this sense of love, of understanding, of knowing that it's not always going to be like what you are experiencing, that there is possibility. And um, so I did. It was kind of like I leveled up a little bit. I would still go through depressive cycles, because I was trying to be something that I wasn't. Like how I grew up was, keeping up with the Joneses. We were the golden kids. We had to be the best, or the, um, just very competitive in that kind of world. And that didn't match who I was. I saw it differently. I knew what you were thinking, what you were feeling, and I cared about it. I felt everything around me, and I wanted to live in a different world. But, you know, so it was, but I was young, and it was that push me, pull me, trying to be something. If I just be this, then maybe I'll be loved, I'll be accepted, I'll be approved of, all of those things. But so I would go through periods of depression and being down, and then I'd be up and I'd be down. During those times of depression, I would see the volunteer firefighter. Like I moved to Hawaii when I was in my 20s, and I would go through down times, and I would see him on the beach standing there in his checkered flannel shirt in Hawaii with the same outfit on. And I was just like, oh my God, I'm crazy. I've got to be crazy. When I was 22, I moved up to Bellingham, went to college. I was waiting tables at a restaurant. I met this woman, Courtney, and her friend Jennifer, and I waited on them at lunch, and they stayed with me all day. And I just had this really great experience with them and just bonded. Courtney left her card on the table, and it just said Courtney, and there was no phone number. I mean, nothing. It was just her name. And I was like, well, this is kind of weird. But Bellingham is up on the Canadian border. It's very beautiful. Back then, Fairhaven was this part that was kind of this hippie area, and that's where Tony's Coffee House was and the Fairhaven building. Fairhaven building was this old brick building, and there was coffee shops and a lot of art galleries and restaurants in it and some offices. For some reason, I was just compelled. It was a walk up. It was like a five-story walk up with a courtyard in the middle. And I was compelled to go to the top floor. And I just walked into that back corner and to this office, and the shades were closed. And I got to the door, and Courtney opened it. She opened the door and she said, "Well, there you are." And I was like, but it was kind of like I was in this foggy daze. And so I went in and we talked about, I said, "Well, what do you do?" And she said, "Well, I do therapy." And I was thinking maybe you could come and see me. And I was like, "Yeah." And she said, "But I'm a therapist and I'm not registered with the state of Washington." She made that very clear. And so we figured out a sliding scale because I was, just a kid. And but I knew I wanted to spend time with her. And I did. And she talked to me about energy and energy in your body and your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions. And she like counseled me in such a way that things started to shift and changed for me, but I'd never heard anything like it. And so I saw her regularly, two, three times a week for about 9 months. And then, I was starting to feel a lot better. And that's when I decided to move to Hawaii, and she was going to go home. And I never asked her where home was or um, what what that meant. And so my last two sessions, she told me who she was. And she's a walk-in. She's an ET guide, but she was a walk-in. She told me that I'm a star seed. I'm from Sirius B, that what my star seed mission is. Um, and she told me a whole bunch of things, which she proceeded to brainwipe me, though, afterward. I remember her telling me that's what I remembered was that she was a walk-in and that, where she was from. And once again, I thought, oh my God, I must be crazy. I mean, who has these kinds of experiences, right? I mean, these are like real people to me. I'm seeing these things and having these interactions. And so then after the second visit, I was down saying goodbye to my family, and I was driving home, and there's a certain part of the mountain where you come up and go down, and then you're into Bellingham. And Lake Sammamish is off to the left, and it's this beautiful area. I had an old Volvo then with a sunroof, playing my music really loud, and I looked up, and it was like an upside down aircraft carrier was just floating in the sky. And I was like, oh my gosh. But I wasn't scared. And I pulled over and I got out and I looked and I was just looking at it. And it was amazing, the detail, the lights. And then it rose up and it collected like these little, like white pod, like tic tac looking things. One, two, three, four, five. Shoop, 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 like that. And then it kind of hovered and then boom, took off. And then I had missing time. It came to and I was in line at the grocery store and I had a can of cream of chicken soup and a box of crackers. And everybody was talking about it in line. I mean, you couldn't miss it. There was all kinds of sightings and people saw that large craft and they saw the little craft, and um, everybody was talking about it. And then it was really strange because, like, the next day, nobody talked about it anymore. And I looked it up in the Bellingham Herald. I went back into the archives, and there was nothing. It was really unusual, but that's what I learned from Courtney, because now Courtney is my guide, and she comes to me and has for about 7 years now. And she is the one who's talked to me about soul contracts. And so that's how I got started in this work when I was about 52, which was 7 years ago. But fast forward, life, continued on up and down cycles, trying to be something that I wasn't and thinking I was crazy. So did a lot of medication, a lot of therapy, a lot of I did electric shock treatments. I was trying to zap my brain, like thinking, oh my God, there is something so wrong with me. And until when I was 52, I went in and saw this nurse practitioner, and he said, Jen, you're the sanest crazy person I've ever met. And and he said, have you ever thought that you were psychic? And I thought, oh my God, here we go again. This is another one. But then he said the sentence, I know you are because I am. And that changed everything. All those appointments that were supposed to be therapy, they turned into like psychic coaching sessions. He's a very interesting human. I was a nurse practitioner studying to be a psychiatrist at the UW, and he is studying psychiatry, like folks who have a delusional disorder are like on the cusp of psychic. Like there's such a crossover, and but it was wonderful. I mean, he eventually, explained to me like this is not a liability, and you're not nuts. This is real, and you can help people. And so that's what I do now. Now I do readings. I have a YouTube channel. I'm writing books. I've got several books. Two of them are finished, ready to get published. And I channel. I work with shamans on Friday mornings, and we find missing people and unite them with their families, or their families can let them go if they've crossed on. Um, so many, many things that I do now. I teach classes, but I love working with people. And so soul contracts is how I really started at 52. And it was understanding, I'd read people's works, but I had this because in speaking with Courtney back, 30 years when that started, um, that um, that this was like the foundation of why we are here. And so to me, my mission is helping people to understand like the missing map of consciousness. That's what it is to me. So my work, it began with soul contracts, but over time, the soul contract work started to ask much larger questions. And when most people hear the term soul contract, they think of an agreement made before birth, like between two souls. The idea is that we agreed to meet certain people, have certain relationships, and go through particular experiences so that we could learn something from one another. That was the framework I originally worked within. But after years of readings, healings, and teaching soul contracts, I began to see something different. And this is what Courtney, I channel her every morning between 3 and 5 a.m. And I type into my computer. And so this is what began years ago. Um, so I see it as something very different now. And I kept seeing that the person was not necessarily the contract. The relationship was not the contract. Even the experience itself was not necessarily the contract. Those things were revealing the contract. And I began to understand that we do not necessarily have fixed contracts with particular people. We have energetic contracts with spirit. What is being reflected back to us, that which we need to learn most? And it shows up with the people, the experiences, the energies in our lives. People, relationships, and circumstances, they become the mirrors through which those contracts are being revealed. And that distinction matters because it preserves our free will. That's the whole point of being a human, you guys, here in the third dimension on the planet Earth, is we have free will. We make choice. And that is the third dimension. It's the duality of choice. So if every important relationship and every painful experience were arranged before we came here, then we would have to ask where the choice begins. We would also have to ask whether another person is required for us to fulfill our purpose. So, what I began to see was that the person can change, circumstance can change, the external story can change, but the underlying energetic pattern continues to present itself until it becomes conscious. Someone may experience the same fundamental wound through a parent, a marriage, a friendship, career, illness, or a financial struggle. The situations look completely different, but the emotional frequency underneath them is the same. So in soul contract work, I found that much of the curriculum of the third dimension is organized around one foundational belief that I am not enough. I am not lovable enough. I am not successful enough. I am not spiritual enough. I am not worthy enough. And I am not safe enough. Or I do not have enough. That's a biggie. The belief takes on many forms, but beneath those forms is the experience of separation from our inherent wholeness. And once that belief is active, it begins to shape how we interpret our experiences. We do not simply experience what is happening. We experience what is happening through the contract. A delayed response, it becomes rejection. A disagreement, it becomes about abandonment. A mistake, it becomes about proof of failure. Someone else's, their success, it becomes evidence that we are falling behind. The contract then becomes a lens through which we understand ourselves and the world around us. So soul contract work became a way of making that lens visible. So first we discover the contract, then we recognize how it has shaped our perceptions, our relationships, and our choices. And often there is a period of collapse or surrender when the old way of understanding our lives, where it no longer works, and then awareness begins. We see the pattern not as punishment, but as information. And we begin to release the emotional charge that was connected to it. Eventually, we can rewrite our relationship with the experience and integrate what it has taught us. The goal is not to erase our past. It is not to pretend that something painful was actually wonderful. The goal is no longer um, to allow the past to unconsciously determine the choices that are available to us now. Soul contract work is not simply about discovering why someone entered our life. It's about understanding what the experience activated within us and what choices became possible once we can see the pattern. The person may have been the mirror, but the work, it belongs to us. And the freedom belongs to us too. So as this work developed, I realized that I was not simply helping people to identify recurring emotional patterns. I was looking at how consciousness develops through our human experience. And that realization, it led me to another question. If the third dimension has a particular emotional curriculum, what are the other dimensions actually for? And that was the bridge between my soul contract work and then my dimensional work. The soul contract work, it revealed the emotional pattern. The dimensional work began revealing the architecture that surrounds that pattern. And together they began forming what I now think of as a missing map of consciousness. And so, why may this map be missing? And a great deal of spiritual exploration right now focuses on proving that consciousness continues beyond the body. We study near-death experience, mediumship, contact experiences with our faraway friends, past lives, mystical states, energy healing, multidimensional phenomenon, all help us to understand that reality is far greater than what we can physically see. And I find it all extraordinary and necessary. Near-death experiences, they show us that our consciousness continues. Mediumship, it shows us that awareness, relationship, and love continue. Mystical experiences, they reveal unity. And contact experiences, they invite us to consider other forms of intelligence. But for me, just reaffirm that, yes, the universe is very vast, but it's also very small. And it's about inclusion and love and belongingness. Energy healing reveals that consciousness interacts with the body and the energetic field. Each gives us an important place of a much larger picture. But once we recognize that consciousness survives the body, then another question will emerge. Why did consciousness choose to enter a body in the first place? And what are we here to do while we are embodied? And why would infinite consciousness enter into limitation? And why would we come into a world where we do not remember everything that we are? Why would we enter relationships, uncertainty, grief, love, fear, longing, emotion, and choice? So I believe emotion is not an obstacle to our spirituality. Emotion is central to the purpose of embodiment. The spiritual world is not separate from our human life. Human life is where consciousness encounters emotion, limitation, relationship, contrast, and free will. That is the laboratory. The marvel is not only that consciousness continues after our death, the marvel is that infinite consciousness is willing to become human. That blows me away. It is willing to enter a body, move through emotion, and make choices without consciously remembering everything that it is. From that perspective, being human is not a lesser spiritual state. It is an extraordinary experience of consciousness. We have many important pieces of the map. Spiritual traditions, they give us one piece. Psychology, it gives us another. Near-death research gives us another. Mediumship, mysticism, consciousness studies, contact experiences, and energy healing each contribute something very important. But these pieces are rarely placed within one coherent developmental architecture. So, how does embodiment, emotion, free will, the soul, and multidimensional consciousness belong to the same map? Well, and how does a painful relationship connect to the evolution of consciousness? And how does the emotional curriculum of the third dimension prepare us to experience unity? How do we integrate expanded states of awareness without rejecting our humanity? These are the questions that are at the center of my work. So, what are the dimensions? I know you're all asking that. Dimensions are often discussed as places that we ascend to, and they may be described as levels that we are supposed to reach or spiritual destinations that are somehow better than the human world. Sometimes spirituality creates the impression that the goal is to move beyond the third dimension as quickly as possible. But that did not match what I was being shown, what Courtney started to implant in me, 30 some years ago. I began to understand the dimensions as fields of consciousness, that each dimension has its own function, perspective, and way of organizing our experience. They are not simply places outside of us. They are capacities of consciousness that we can encounter and we can embody. This is not a ladder where the higher dimensions are good and the lower dimensions are bad. Each dimension contributes something essential to the whole. We do not leave one dimension behind as we expand into another. We integrate it. The dimensions give us an architecture for understanding how consciousness moves from being into pattern, into emotion, into choice, into awakening, unity, soul awareness, frequency, infinite memory, light creation, harmony, and then completion. So, how does studying the dimensions help us? Studying the dimensions, it gives us orientation. It helps us understand where we are within our own consciousness, what we may be learning, and what capacity is trying to develop within us. Without a map, spiritual awakening, it can become incredibly confusing. I experienced that, you know, 7 years ago when I was in that office and talking with Asher. Um, and from then on, that's when I started my YouTube channel and I started doing readings online and I was doing collaborations with other readers and things were just happening because once I went from not accepting and resistance and thinking I was nuts to, wow, okay, this is how I can be a part of helping move, to move humanity forward. But it was a lot. It was a lot of information, knowing what people think, feel, feeling everything when I go outside, right? I look at people and I see the colors around them. I see the sacred geometric patterning that is in your aura and your energy field when you're thinking certain emotions. When I do readings with people, I see it. And when they're talking to me and they're feeling something different, that patterning will change, you know? When I would do readings with certain collaborations, other readers, things would come into my apartment in Seattle where I was living, and I would be exhausted. Like I'd have to sleep the next day after doing those kinds of shows. you know? So, you know, it can become incredibly confusing. And so what I want to do is help people to understand like this map so they understand themselves and what they are experiencing, but also how to use discernment, practice discernment, understand what that means. You know, a person may suddenly become more sensitive to energy. They may experience more in their vivid dreams, synchronicities. They have experiences of expanded intuition, contact with beings in their sleep, in their dream time, or moments of profound unity. At the same time, they may feel emotionally overwhelmed, exhausted, disconnected from their former identity, or unable to function in the life that they once knew. You know, there are activation points in humanity, and COVID was one of them. More and more people are looking for answers. I can't tell you the number of folks that come to me for readings that I work with that were like, I didn't even think of this stuff until 2 or 3 months ago, and now I can't stop. But it's overwhelming. The thoughts are overwhelming, and I'm like, okay, all right, that's good. It's all good, but let's slow it down and you so you can understand. Because without context, they may believe that something has gone wrong. A dimensional map, it helps us to understand that an expansion of consciousness also requires integration. Having an experience of another dimensional field does not mean that we permanently live there. It means that we have accessed a particular capacity of consciousness. So then the questions, they become, how do I bring that awareness into my human life? If I experience unity during meditation, can I remain connected to the awareness during a disagreement? If I receive intuitive information, can I discern it clearly without surrendering my judgment or my free will and lose myself? If I recognize that everything is interconnected, can I still maintain healthy boundaries? If I understand myself as an energetic being, can I also remain present in my physical body and care for it? The dimensional work, it helps us to distinguish between accessing a state of consciousness and then actually embodying it. A spiritual experience may happen in a moment. Embodiment requires practice, emotional honesty, discernment, and choice. So I'm just going to run through the dimensions so you understand a little bit. So the first dimension, it introduces the still point and the foundational experience of our being. It is the original point of awareness before consciousness begins creating a story about what is happening. In practical terms, the still point can help us interrupt any reactivity. We pause, we breathe, we become present. Think of your foundation, your structure. Think of the rocks. Think of going deep within the earth and just think of that stillness. Think of the still point as a light within your heart, like it's just the beginning of you before consciousness comes into play. We recognize that before we are the fear, the anger, or the story, we are first awareness. And this does not make the emotion disappear. It creates enough space for us to choose how we will respond. Remember, you are awake, you are aware, and you are at choice at all moments of your life. You choose how you want to respond. So the first dimension, it reminds us that beneath everything we think, we feel, and experience, There is an awareness that we are capable of witnessing it. Now, 2D introduces pattern, polarity, the subconscious, and the matrix beneath the form. It invites us to examine the structures that operate beneath our visible lives. Why do I keep choosing the same kind of relationship? I have the same relationship over and over with different people. Why does the same fear appear whenever I'm about to become more visible? Why do I keep recreating something that I consciously say I do not want? Why does it keep happening? The second dimension, it helps us to understand that the subconscious is not working against us. It is the maintaining of a pattern until we become conscious enough to change it. And this is one of the places where the dimensional work connects directly with soul contract work. Soul contract reveals the emotional agreement. So 2D helps us to understand the subconscious pattern that keeps recreating it. Now, the third dimension, it introduces duality, opposites, emotion, choice, and free will, good, bad, us versus them, light, dark. What is it that's being reflected back to me that I need to learn most? This is that mirroring that we talk about, where you have a choice. Which way do you want to go? This is where spiritual understanding, it becomes a lived experience. It is one thing to understand compassion in theory. It is another to choose compassion when we hurt. It is one thing to say that we are sovereign, we are independent, but it is another to make a decision that may disappoint someone. It is one thing to believe that we are enough. It is another to stop pursuing people or situations that continually ask us to prove our worth. The third dimension is where knowledge becomes choice. This is also why I do not see the third dimension as a spiritual mistake. The 3D, us living here, it's our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, and they are energy. We are awake, we are aware, we are at choice at all times. It's why we are here. And that's exactly our spiritual work now, is to stay in it, be here, stay grounded if you can. It's okay if you're not, but that's the whole point of us being here. We came here to encounter that contrast, to experience the emotion, and to make choices. If everything were remembered and every outcome were already known, choice would not carry the same meaning. So the third dimension, it gives us consciousness, the experience of choosing from within limitation. Now, 4D. The fourth dimension is the bridge of the heart and the beginning of the awakening. It allows us to hold more than one truth at the same time. I can recognize that someone wounded me and also recognize that they were acting through their own wounds. I can have compassion for them without making their behavior acceptable. I can forgive without restoring access to me. I can love someone and still choose not to remain in a relationship with them. This is an important expansion of our consciousness because it moves us beyond rigid, polarized thinking. Now, the fourth dimension does not ask us to choose between compassion and boundaries. It teaches us how to hold both. The heart becomes a bridge between the human experience and a larger spiritual perspective. Now, the fifth dimension, a lot of talk about the fifth. The fifth dimension introduces unity consciousness and divine perspective. This does not mean that individuality disappears or that everything becomes pleasant. It means that we begin to perceive the larger field of connection. We begin to understand that healing ourselves, it changes how we participate in the collective. We recognize that our emotions, our choices, and our actions move through the larger field. But unity does not mean the absence of boundaries. A healthy experience of unity, it allows both connection and individuality. I can recognize that we are part of the same field while also understanding that I am responsible for my choices and you are responsible for yours. This is why we cannot bypass the emotional work of the third dimension by reaching towards the fifth. Unity consciousness is not pretending that pain and anger, grief, or conflict that they do not exist. It is not denying our human experience in order to appear spiritually evolved. Unity consciousness becomes possible because we have learned to remain conscious in the presence of human emotion. We can experience pain without allowing pain to become our entire identity. We can recognize difference without automatically creating separation. We can hold compassion for another person, without abandoning ourselves. Now, the sixth dimension. The sixth reveals the architecture of the soul. I'm a spirit nerd. I love to know how it all works. I want to know why it all works, how it all works, what it is. And so the sixth is about the architecture of the soul. It helps us recognize the intelligence and organization beneath what may initially appear very random. We begin perceiving the relationships among our experiences with symbols, patterns, intuition, sacred geometry, and our purpose. We stop asking only, why is this happening to me? And then we begin to ask, what is this experience? What is it showing me? What pattern is being revealed, both physically, spiritually, emotionally, and geometrically? What capacity is trying to develop through this? What is possible here that I have not considered? The sixth dimension helps us see that the soul has an architecture. Our experiences, they're not simply isolated events. They can be understood within larger patterns of consciousness. This perspective does not ask us to spiritualize suffering or to deny our reality. It just invites us to search for meaning without assuming that every painful event was predetermined. Now, seventh dimension, this introduces sound as a creative force. So when I speak about sound here, I'm not just referring to audible sound. I'm speaking about vibration, resonance, tone, and frequency as organizing principles of consciousness. Before something becomes physical, there is an energetic pattern. I talked a little bit about that, seeing the geometric patterns that are in our energy. But before that pattern, before it becomes form, there is frequency. 7D helps us understand how consciousness begins organizing the potential into expression. And this is why so many spiritual traditions, why they have connected creation with sound, breath, language, chanting, prayer, and sacred tones. Words, they carry frequency. Our thoughts carry frequency. Our emotions carry frequency. Intention carries frequency. So, where we are at is what we attract. What we think about becomes. So, 7D, it asks us to become more conscious of what we are broadcasting into that field. It also helps us to recognize resonance. Why does a particular person, place, sound, symbol, or teaching, why does it feel so familiar? You have those moments? Why do certain words activate something within you before you intellectually begin to understand them? Why can music move emotion through the body without explaining anything? The seventh dimension, it helps us understand that consciousness can communicate through resonance before the mind translate the experience into language. And for all of you Syrian star seeds out there, frequency is your language. You feel everything. Music can heal things for you. You feel others, their thoughts, feelings, emotion. And this dimension, it also introduces a deeper level of responsibility. Because if frequency precedes form, what are we repeatedly sounding into our lives? What are we reinforcing through our thoughts, through our language, our beliefs, and our emotional patterns? Because remember, your sacred geometry, it changes with your thoughts because your thoughts are in different dimensions. So this does not mean that every difficult experience is something that we create through an incorrect thought. It means that we can just become more conscious uh, participants in the frequencies that we sustain. The seventh dimension, it teaches us that creation is not only about asking for what we want, it is about becoming resonant with what we are asking to experience. You become it, you attract it. Okay, so eighth dimension is connected to the Akashic records and the master frequency of the infinite. So I understand the Akashic records as a field of consciousness containing the energetic memory of your experience. I am a reader, I am psychic. So all readers, psychic people, channelers are accessing the eighth dimension when doing their work. That's where the Akashic records lie. Your past, present, your future, and you're jumping on timelines. That's why readings are always different with different readers because it's the possibility of you. And it's described as a cosmic library. So I don't experience them as books that are stored like in a spiritual building. I experience it as a sacred geometric web where lines are parallel, they're stacked and they're stacked at an angle. And these are the different possibilities and potentials of you or your past. So that's where free will comes into play. What timeline are you going to choose? To choose to jump on, change the trajectory of your experience. So I experience the Akash as a living field of information. And the eighth dimension contains patterns of what has been experienced, what is being experienced, and what exists as potential. It includes the energetic memory of souls, of choices, relationships, civilizations, and collective experience. When we access the Akashic field, we are not simply looking backward. We may also be perceiving patterns, probabilities, and unrealized possibilities. And that distinction is important because a potential is not the same as a predetermined future. The Akashic records do not have to eliminate free will. They can show us the energetic pathways that are created by previous choices and the possibilities that may emerge from the choices that we are making now. So 8D helps us move beyond our personal story and recognize the larger continuity of consciousness. An experience in our present life may connect to a much older pattern of fear may not originate solely in our current circumstances. A gift may feel familiar because consciousness has developed that capacity through other expressions and experiences. The purpose of accessing the Akash is not simply to collect fascinating information about who we may have been. The practical question is, how does this information help me to live now? Does it explain a pattern that I'm ready to change? Does it help me to understand a gift that I'm ready to use? Does it bring compassion to an experience I could not previously understand? Does it open a new possibility? Information from the Akashic field should not imprison us within another identity. It should expand the choices that are available to us in the present. So the eighth dimension also helps us to understand um, everything that is similar. So from the human perspective, we experience time as a sequence. There is no past, a present, and a future. Within the eighth, consciousness may perceive many points of experience at once. And this does not mean that our human experience of time is unreal. It means that time may be one way that consciousness organizes experience while embodied. So 8D allows us to glimpse a larger field in which memory, present, awareness, and potential can coexist. 9D. So there are three more, you guys. The ninth dimension is where consciousness begins becoming light. When I use the word light, I am not using it simply as a metaphor for goodness. I am speaking about light as information, intelligence, frequency, and creative organization. In 9D, identity becomes less dependent on personality, your biography, and any physical form. Consciousness begins to recognize itself as a field of intelligent light. We can allow an identity to dissolve without assuming that we are disappearing. I'm channeling Courtney here. So, we begin to ask, what remains when the story changes? What remains when a role ends? And what remains when I release the identity that I built around my pain? The ninth dimension teaches us that consciousness can transform without being destroyed. We do not lose ourselves as we expand. We discover that the self is larger, much larger than we understood. And I'm going to talk about the light dimensions, and that's it. So there's three. The 10th, the 11th, and the 12th dimensions are what I think of as the light dimensions. The word dimension becomes more difficult here because the human mind, the 3D linear mind, it naturally wants to imagine a place. We want to know where the 10th dimension is located and what it looks like. But these dimensions are less like physical locations and more like increasingly refined fields of light, frequency, intelligence, and creative consciousness. As we move into the light dimensions, form becomes less dense. Individual identity, it becomes less central to us. Information is not necessarily communicated through words, images, or linear thought. It may be experienced as direct knowing, harmonic relationship, geometry, frequency, or light. Now, the 10D, the 10th dimension is the living light of creation. In the ninth dimension, consciousness reorganizes itself as light. In the 10th dimension, light becomes living creation. This is the light that contains intelligence and generative potential. It is not static limitation or illumination. It is consciousness in motion. The 10th dimension helps us understand that creation is not merely the production of physical objects. Creation is the movement of intelligence into expression. An idea is an expression of creation. So is a healing, a new choice, a relationship reorganizing itself around a greater truth is an expression of creation. At the 10th dimensional level, your consciousness is working within the living patterns through which realities can form. And this does not mean that studying the 10th dimension gives the human personality um, unlimited control over reality. It helps us to recognize the difference between personal desire and participation in a larger creative intelligence. So the question then shifts from how do I make the universe give me what I want to what is seeking to be created through me? How can I participate consciously within the living intelligence of creation? The practical expression of the 10th dimension is aligned creation. We become less interested in forcing an outcome, and we become more interested in listening for what has life within it. We begin to notice the difference between an idea produced by fear and an idea that carries genuine creative energy. Make sense? So we are asking whether something is trying to be controlled or whether it is ready to emerge. So the 11th dimension is the harmonic field of unity. And by this point, unity is no longer simply an idea of interconnectedness. It is an experience as a harmonic relationship. Individual frequencies, they do not have to become identical in order to belong to the same field. This is important because unity is sometimes misunderstood as sameness. But harmony, it requires distinction. A musical chord is created through different notes, entering a meaningful relationship with one another. If every note were exactly the same, there would be no harmony. The 11th dimension, it helps us understand that unity is coherence rather than unity as uniformity. So each consciousness has its own frequency and expression, but those frequencies, they can participate within a larger harmonic field. And this gives us another way of understanding the collective. The collective is not created when everyone thinks the same way. It is created when difference can exist without separation, and when individual expressions can enter a coherent relationship with the whole. The practical value of the 11th dimension is that it changes how we understand belonging. Belonging does not require us to abandon our frequency. We do not have to diminish our individuality in order to participate in unity. We also do not have to reject the collective in order to remain sovereign or an individual. True unity can hold both. And so 11D invites us to ask, can I remain fully myself while recognizing that I am part of something larger? Can I be in a relationship without losing my own frequency? Can different truths, gifts, and expressions contribute to a more coherent whole? This harmonic field may also help explain how consciousness can communicate and organize itself beyond physical separation. So what we perceive as separate points of awareness may be participating within a shared field of resonance. All right, the last one. The 12th dimension is the field of completion. So I think of it as the source field of completion. Completion does not mean that consciousness stops or that creation ends. It means that all of the dimensions are held within a unified field. Nothing is excluded. The still point of the first dimension, the patterns of the second, the emotions and the choices of the third, awakening of the fourth, unity of the fifth, and the architecture of six are all held within it. The sound of the seventh, the infinite records of the eighth, the intelligence, the light of the ninth, the living creation of 10, and the harmonic unity of 11, they are also present. So 12D is not simply the final floor of a spiritual building. It is the field in which the entire architecture can be perceived as one um, living system. So, from that perspective, completion does not mean perfection, it just means wholeness. Nothing that we have experienced is outside our consciousness. Nothing has to be rejected in order for us to return to source. Even the experiences that we associate with separation, limitation, and pain belong within the larger movement of consciousness, becoming aware of itself. So, the practical teaching of 12 is integration. Can I allow all of myself to belong? Can I recognize that my humanity and my divinity, they are not opposing realities? And can I understand that the journey into separation and the return to unity are part of the same movement? Can I stop trying to eliminate parts of my experience and begin integrating what they have taught me? So at the 12th dimension, completion, it's not an ending. It is the recognition, it's the recognition that the whole was present within every part. So let's bring the map together. This is why I do not see the dimensions as a ladder where the goal is to reach the 12th dimension and leave everything else behind. The 12th dimension, it contains the first. The light dimensions contain the emotional dimensions. Unity, it contains individuality. Source contains embodiment. We do not graduate from being human by learning about the higher dimensions. We become more capable of bringing a larger field of consciousness into our human lives. The purpose of studying the light dimensions is not to escape into the light. It is to understand what light asks of us while we are embodied. Can we become clear carriers of information? Can we create with greater consciousness? Can we enter relationships without abandoning our unique frequency? Can we participate in unity without demanding sameness? And can we integrate our experience rather than dividing them into spiritual and unspiritual? The light dimensions show us what consciousness may be at its most expansive. The human experience gives us the opportunity to make that expansion meaningful through emotion, relationship, and choice. And that is why the map must include all 12 dimensions. If we study only the light, we may lose contact with the purpose of embodiment. If we study only the emotional, we may lose sight of the larger consciousness that's moving through them. The map brings them all together. The early dimensions help us understand being, pattern, emotion, choice, awakening, and the soul. 7 and 8 help us understand frequency, creation, memory, and potential. 9 through 12 helps us understand intelligent light, living creation, harmonic unity, and completion. The value of studying the dimensions is not simply learning what may exist beyond our ordinary perception. The value is learning how these different capacities of consciousness can become available within ordinary life. So, can the still point help me when I am anxious? Can awareness of subconscious pattern help me stop repeating a relationship dynamic? Can an understanding of free will help me make a different choice? Can the heart help me hold compassion and boundaries simultaneously? Can unity consciousness help me recognize how I affect the larger field? Can an understanding of soul architecture help me find meaning without giving away my agency? Frequency, can it help me become conscious of what I am contributing? Can the Akashic field help me understand a pattern without imprisoning me within the past? Can intelligent light help me release an identity that has become too small? Can living light help me participate in creation? Can harmonic unity teach me how to belong without abandoning myself? This is where dimensional study it becomes practical. It gives us a framework for understanding our consciousness, but it also gives us a way to work with our consciousness. It helps us identify what we are experiencing, what we are being invited to develop, and how we can bring expanded awareness into the reality of our everyday lives. So, in closing, I do not consider this map complete. I think that we are still discovering it. I'm still channeling it every morning, more and more clarity. But what I am beginning to see is that consciousness does not evolve by escaping human experience. It evolves by moving through human experience consciously. Soul contract work reveals the emotional patterns that shape our lives. Dimensional work reveals the larger architecture in which those patterns exist. And together they offer a way of understanding our lives, not only that our consciousness continues, but why consciousness may have chosen embodiment at all. Perhaps the purpose of spiritual awakening is not to leave the human experience behind. Perhaps it is to bring more of our consciousness into the human experience, to become conscious within our emotions, to recognize the patterns through which we have been living, and to exercise choice where we once reacted automatically, or to experience our humanity without forgetting our divinity. The soul contract work, it revealed the emotional pattern. Dimensional work, it revealed the architecture. And together they are beginning to reveal a missing map of our consciousness. And the human being stands within all of it. We are not separate from the map. We are where the map becomes our lived experience. You know, for me, it's the 6 calls. Calling on my guide team of 100% divine light, please assist me with this work today. By the power of grace, I consciously state that my entire being at all levels shall be reset to wholly aligned with 100% divine light now. By the power of grace, I consciously state that my consciousness, subconscious, highest self, physical and energy bodies shall be reset to wholly align with 100% divine light now. 4 more. By the power of grace, I consciously state that my guide team shall be made up of only beings that fully align with 100% divine light now. By the power of grace, I consciously state that any spiritual attachments that I have created that do not align fully with 100% divine light be released for the greatest and the highest good of all now. By the power of grace, I consciously state that my environment through infinity shall be reset to wholly align with 100% divine light now. By the power of grace, I consciously state that only beings, energies, and experiences that fully align with 100% divine light be allowed within my energy fields now. Those are the six calls. Can be a really great way to tether you back into you, your life, your spirit guide team.